Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I'm showing you how to make your most versatile doll room ever with changeable wallpaper and floors. Now obviously this isn't exactly a new concept, it's just my spin on it, and I am really excited to share it with you. All you need for this project is some foam board. I get mine at Dollar Tree, some hot glue, scrapbook paper, a little bit of like regular cardboard, and a box cutter or X-Acto knife. You're going to start by cutting out the piece for the floor, and your walls are going to be glued on top of the floor, so this is just the measurement of your space where you're going to put your doll room. In my case, it's going in this really kind of narrow space, so it's going to be 7 3/8 of an inch by 23 inches. And I just cut that out of foam board. Next, you're going to cut out the center back wall because this is going to be a room with 3 walls. You could do this with 2. It would actually make putting in the paper easier. For me, I wanted 3 because of where I'm putting it. And so your center back wall is going to be 16 inches because that's going to be the height of the doll room, by the width of your floor, which in my case is 23 inches. Then you're going to cut out your 2 side walls, and these are again 16 inches tall, and the width of them is dependent on the width obviously of your floor minus the thickness of your foam board. And so for me, that's a little less than 1/4 of an inch thick. I just went ahead and subtracted 1/4 of an inch, so I cut mine out at 16 inches tall by 7 1/8 of an inch wide. Once all of your walls are cut out, the next step is to mark the placement of your trim or molding, which is also going to act as the brackets to hold your wallpaper later on. So I should note that these measurements are based very specifically on 16-inch tall wallpaper or walls. However, you could shorten your walls down to, I wouldn't go any less than 14 inches. It will change one of your measurements, and I will note that as I go along. So first thing you want to do is decide which end of the wall is going to be the bottom and which end is going to be the top. It doesn't matter too much, but if you have an end that has a neater cut, then I would put that at the bottom because it will make it easier to glue the walls to the floor later. So your first mark is going to be 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the wall. So start at the bottom of the wall, measure up 1/8 of an inch, and draw a line. Your second mark is going to be 7 inches from the bottom of the wall. So measure up 7 inches and draw a line. The third line is going to be 2 3/4 inches from the top. So start at the top, measure down 2 3/4 of an inch, and draw a line. And if you are shortening your wall to a shorter height, what you want is for the space between the second line and the third line to be 6 1/4 inches apart. So you have 2 options. You can either measure from the second line up 6 1/4 inches, or you can measure from the bottom 13 1/4 inches. Either way, it should end up the same. And the reason you want that specific gap between the 2 lines is because that's where your wallpaper is going to go. And I specifically planned this project to use 6 inches of wallpaper, which is half of a typical 12 by 12 inch sheet of scrapbook paper, making it the most efficient use of the scrapbook paper that you're going to be using for your wallpaper. Now this does leave 2 3/4 of an inch above that second line of molding if you're doing a 16-inch tall wall, and I kind of thought that that would look a little odd. So I decided to put some narrow windows along the top of the wall. To do this, I started by cutting a template of cardboard 2.5 by 1 inches, and then I just used that and traced around it always making sure that it was spaced 1 inch from the top of the wall, and then space them about 2 inches apart along that center back wall. For the side walls, they weren't long enough to do more than one window, so I just centered them on the side walls and traced them out again 1 inch from the top of the wall. And once they were all traced, I just took a box cutter and cut them out. We've got all of the placement for the trim marked. Now it's time to actually cut the trim out. I started with the side walls, and for all of them they're going to be the same length, which is the width of your wall minus 1/8 of an inch. So, and this is for the side walls only. So for my purposes, that was a 7 1/8 inch wide side wall, minus that 1/8 of an inch is 7 inches. So all of my strips are going to be 7 inches long, but with different widths. So I cut 3 strips out that were 1/2 of an inch wide out of foam board, and one that was 3/4 inch wide, also out of foam board. I then cut 2 strips that were 1/4 inch wide out of a thinner cardboard. I used a shoebox, but you could also use like corrugated cardboard and just squish it together so that it's a little flatter. I suppose you could use foam board, but it is very thick, and since you're putting the scrapbook paper in, and scrapbook paper is not that thick, I would not recommend it because it just might leave too much room for the paper to kind of wiggle around. Now it's time to start gluing these trim pieces on. So you're going to take your side walls and go ahead and determine which side is going to be the front of the room and which side is going to glue onto that center back wall. And all of these strips of foam board and cardboard, you're going to want to line them up with the front edge of the wall and have an 1/8 of an inch gap at the back of the wall where it's going to glue to the center back wall. So to start out, you're going to take one of your 1/2 inch strips of foam board and glue it to the wall, lining the bottom of the 1/2 inch strip up with that first line, the one that's closest to the bottom of your wall. Then you're going to take a 1/4 inch strip of cardboard and line the top of it up with the second line that you want. Next, you're going to take another 1/2 inch strip of foam board and lay it on top of that 1/4 inch strip of cardboard, lining the bottoms up. So what this should do is that you should have the foam board hanging 1/4 of an inch taller than that piece of cardboard that you just glued down. Next, you're going to move up to the third line, and you're going to take the other 1/4 inch strip of cardboard and line the bottom of it up with the third line. So basically you're kind of gluing it slightly above it in a way. And then take that 3/4 inch piece of foam board and glue it on top of the cardboard, this time lining the tops up so that the overhang is below the cardboard. And then finally you're going to glue that last 1/2 inch strip of foam board at the top of the room, completely lining it up with that top edge. And now you can see how this creates a bracket for the scrapbook paper. And you're going to go ahead and repeat this on the other side wall, and then we'll be ready to tackle the back wall. Before you begin gluing the trim onto your center back wall, you need to mark where the trim on your side walls is going to end when they're glued together, because if you glue your trim on your back wall all the way to the edge and then go to glue your side wall on, you're going to have gaps. So the way I marked this was I just lined up the side wall to the edge of the back wall where it's going to be glued later, and just marked where the trim ended on all of the spots, all 4 spots where the trim was. And I did that on both sides, and then I just measured the space between those 2 marks. Now this is going to be different on those 2 middle moldings that are the brackets for your scrapbook paper. They're going to stick out slightly more than the top and bottom trim. For me, I just went ahead and measured in between the space between those 2 that stick out more, and just went with that for the length of the molding for my center back wall. This did create a bit of a gap at the top and bottom, but to me it was just easier than trying to keep track of all of the different lengths that I would have had to track if I had gone with the exact measurements. So once that was determined for the length of the trim for your center back wall, it is just cutting the exact same pieces that were cut for these side walls. So 3 1/2-inch strips out of foam board, 2 1/4-inch strips out of cardboard, and 1 3/4-inch strip out of foam board. And once they're all cut out, you just glue them exactly the same way as you did for the side walls, but of course lining the edges up in between those lines that you marked on the center back wall. So instead of lining up to one edge or the other, line it up in between those marks. With that done, I went ahead and began assembling the room. I started out by gluing the back wall onto the floor, and again, it's glued on top of the floor. So you apply the glue to the bottom of the wall and glue it on top. And I find it helpful to just have something to push up behind it so the wall doesn't fall backwards while the glue is drying and while you prepare the next wall. So then I just take the side wall and run glue along the side and bottom of the wall and push it in to glue between the back wall and the floor. And this just helps really stabilize everything at this point. Plus, again, you still have the whatever you pushed the wall up against to really stabilize it. And then just glue the other wall, same as the last side wall. Glue on the back and the bottom and push it into that corner. And this should also just kind of help everything square up and sit at the proper angles. Next step is optional, but I decided that because there were some imperfections in my gluing as well as the lining up of the molding and everything, that I would add some paneling to the lower half of the wall. So what I did was I cut strips of foam board that were 1 inch wide by 6 inches tall, and this should be about the same regardless of if you have a 16-inch wall or a 14-inch wall. And I glued them between the floor molding and that second line of molding, and I just spaced them apart using one of the pieces of molding. So I started in a corner, glued one in, I would place a piece of molding next to it without gluing it down, and then glue the next one down, and then repeat all the way down, always moving that molding that I was using as a spacer. And then for the sides, I just kind of started again at that corner and worked my way out to the edge, as I found that to be the best way to do it. Like I said, this is optional, but I did find that it really helped cover up some of the imperfections that were there in my gluing and all from earlier. And the last thing was covering up those windows at the top. Now, I use what's called vellum paper, which comes from my card making supplies, and I just cut it 1/2 inch bigger on all sides compared to the window cutout, and just glued it around to the back of the walls. If you didn't want to do that, you could leave them open if you don't mind actually seeing through them to whatever's on the other side. I wanted a frosted look so that I didn't see what's on the other side, because the only thing on the other side of these windows is going to be a wall. Another option is clear plastic, or you could do kind of a frosted glass look by taking clear plastic and doing swirls of hot glue on the back. I've seen that done before. Essentially, at this point, your doll room is done, and you can add whatever scrapbook paper you want for the walls and the floor. For the floor, it's going to be, as far as the width goes, the same width as your side walls, and then the length is kind of, you're going to measure the space between the two side walls to determine that. If it's over 12 inches, you are going to have to use two pieces, and that does give you some more wiggle room because you just overlap the pieces. And if it's a little too big, it's fine. In fact, you're probably better off at that point too big than too small. For the wallpaper, like I said, it's planned for 6-inch tall paper. So just take a piece of scrapbook paper, cut it in half, and you now have 2 strips. For the side walls, of course, you need to trim it down to the width of those walls. And once again, for the center back wall, if it's too wide for your 12-inch paper, I just cut one in half and put them both in overlapping so that, you know, there was no gaps. Getting the wallpaper onto the center back wall can be a little difficult. I found that the best way to do it is to insert the bottom edge into that bottom bracket and then kind of roll the paper a little so that you can get the top edge underneath the top bracket, and then let go and it will flatten out. So now you have a room that you can change the look of just by switching out your wallpaper or your floor paper. But wait, there's more. While I was planning this project, I came up with a way to add windows and do it where you can change like what is being seen out of the window and the placement of the window or the trim around the window without making it permanent to like the piece of scrapbook paper that you have in your room. So to do this, I started out with a piece of clear plastic that was 6 inches tall. That part's non-negotiable, and the width is, I think I ended up with like 3 3/4 inches, but that could technically be adjusted according to what you want or like what picture you've picked for this. So after cutting out my plastic, I then trimmed it with cardstock, and what I did for this, I used 1/4 inch strips around the edges and placed them onto the edge of the plastic on the side edges, those long edges. And then for the top and bottom, I used 1/2 inch strips of cardstock and glued those on. And the 1/2 inch is to allow for some of it to stick up above the molding when you put it onto your into your room. And then I put a strip down the middle along the length side. And I did do that still at 1/2 inch. And I think I probably, if I was to do it again, would do it at 1/4 inch. And then for the image behind the window, I just picked a nice backyard image and sized it so that it was 6 inches tall and printed it off. Trimmed it so that the width was the same as my window, and attached it to some white cardstock. And then you just layer the window over the picture and slide it into the wall. Now, you can do this on the center back wall. I just find it a little difficult because of all of the thickness. So to me, it's easier just to do it on a side wall because you can just slide it right in. And for a simpler version, you could just print off the picture that you want from the window and just trim it in the cardstock. In addition to windows, you can also add pictures to your walls. To do this, I printed off the pictures that I want and backed them in cardstock. Now you could just back it in plain white cardstock and trim it exactly to the size of their picture, or you could do that and then trim the edges with some strips of cardstock to make a frame. Or you could put it onto some colored cardstock and just cut the cardstock a little bigger than your picture and add it to it that way. Either way, once you have your picture backed onto cardstock, you're going to attach it to strips of clear plastic. Now in the video you're going to see that my clear plastic, I'm only adding it to the bottom of the picture, but I found that when doing it that way, it would cause the picture to fall forward, especially on the smaller ones. Some of the bigger ones would sit correctly if you balance them right. But either way, what I would recommend doing instead is to cut your strip of plastic to 6 inches, 6 inches tall, and you know, they don't have to be as wide as the picture, but I would recommend, you know, not making it too much narrower than the picture. And then you just attach your picture to the plastic, and I like to center my pictures onto the scrapbook paper, so this actually makes it very easy because you just center it onto the plastic, and then you can insert it onto the wall just like you did with the scrapbook paper for your wallpaper, and have pictures that can be arranged in whatever way you want. And for both the windows and the pictures, to attach the paper to the cardstock, I used what is called, well, mine is called Stamp and Seal because it's by Stampin' Up, but a lot of craft and scrapbook sections will have, I think they're called tape runners. It's very similar. So I use that to attach everything, but if you didn't have that, you could use stick glue for that. And then for attaching the cardstock to the plastic, I also use the tape runner, but again, if you didn't have that, you don't need it. You could use, I would use hot glue for that part. And finally, I also was able to make a little shelf to add to the room. To do that, I started out with a 1/2 inch strip of the thin cardboard that I used earlier to create the space or the brackets for the scrapbook paper. And I cut that 1/2 inch wide by however long I wanted it to be for the shelf. And then cut a 1 inch strip of foam board, 1 inch by the length of the shelf. And I glued the foam board to the piece of cardboard. I then took another piece of foam board and used it to mark the thickness. So I laid it against the cardboard piece and marked out that thickness. And then cut little squares of foam board, which I then glued right before that line, so leaving a gap between the cardboard and that piece of foam board that's acting as a brace. And then it just slots onto the piece of molding, and this shelf is stable enough to hold very lightweight objects. I wouldn't put anything really heavy on it, but you know, if you have like a little plastic accessory from the dollhouse, it will hold that just fine. And now we are finally done. Now you have a room that you can change the wallpaper, the floors, you can add windows, pictures, and even a small shelf. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you next time.